Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IT Journeys and Convos podcast. And I'm your host, Olumide Ajala. Today, I have a very special guest. Her name is Adrienne Bellehumeur. She's the author of a very interesting book I came across quite recently. The book is titled The 24-Hour Rule. Um, it's 24-hour rule and other secrets for smarter organizations, right? So don't be deceived by the cover, right? It's a very interesting book that teaches you a lot about dynamic documentation, right? It has a label right on the front there that says including the 6 steps of dynamic documentation. And Adrienne is, I would call her the evangelist for the evangelist for effective and dynamic documentation. Right before we hit record on this, we were just chatting about this, and she was saying how this book is something that is life changing, right? And wonderful, not just for people in IT, right? But for people across all fields, right? And when we're talking, documentation in your professional life, right? But also in your personal life, right? In whatever venture, right, you're finding yourself in, right? So be it something you're doing on the side, you're working with an association or a group, you want to document things, right? How do you make sure you document them properly? And what's the 24-hour rule all about? So welcome, Adrienne. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, Olu, for that glowing intro. Hopefully, I can live up to it. Yes.
Okay, Adrian. Before we start, usually I like my guests to do a brief intro of themselves, right? And since you're here now, just give us a little walkthrough on your career history and how you got to this place where you're authoring books for us.
Sure. Okay. I wouldn't say this is the most engaging part of our conversation. I'm a CPA by background, and my background is actually I own a internal control, internal audit firm called Risk Oversight. And that's been the focus of my work for the last 15 years. Actually, almost 20 years has been internal controls, which is really about good process design, good controls, and having companies that work well. That's really how I frame it. I don't see this as a check in the box exercise. And over the years, I've had an interest in documentation best practices. I've actually been speaking and writing about it for a long time. I actually published a previous book. It's a very little book, but it was early in my career on documentation because it's an area, in my opinion, that is, we all do it, we all talk about it, it's a big deal, but we don't have a cohesive way of teaching it across professions. We actually teach what the way documentation is taught is a little bit differently. Lawyers are taught one way, business analysts learn their own lingo, project managers do their own thing, accountants, auditors. So my motivation was just to call to attention this underpinning practice that so many people are doing. It's so important as part of our work. It's such an important skill to have in the people you hire, and to actually call it out for what it is, and just really label it and show the best practices that go into it. So I that's been my motivation. I've been actually working at it for a long time. The book came together out of many years of training, writing about it. It was something that took me a long time because I have been busy with other things. So definitely wasn't. It's not that impressive because it took me, I don't know, 7 years to pull it together. So really nothing that came together quickly. But to me, it's just a message that needs to get out in the work world, especially today's knowledge-based economy. We do need these skills in the workforce, not just talking about tools. We need actual hard skills and documentation, best practices.
Absolutely, absolutely, Adrian. Documentation is key for wherever we find ourselves, and I'm glad to have you here on this. Right. So, Can you give us a brief overview, rundown of your book, the 24-hour rule, and the key principles regarding, documentation management? Just a short summary.
Sure. A core concept that I love to talk about documentation, which sounds a bit funny, is called big D and little d documentation. And it speaks to documentation is not just what we call capital D in organizations, like policies, records, information management systems, very formalized documents, process what you learned that day, how you store things personally. This little d everyday habits, disciplines, skills is so important. And I have the two. I wouldn't say that's the framework of the book, but it's a very important message. You can implement the fanciest sales system in the world, for example, but if you don't have the little d skills of actually recording your prospects, it's not going to work. And I've seen this many times in organizations. You need the actual little d skills to make big D work. So that's a very important message. And I'm not saying I'm against big D. That's actually how I make money, is big D projects. But you need to balance the two. We can't just always talk about big corporate initiatives. We have to talk about the skills that makes this possible. So the basic frame of the book is also, I have my 6 steps of dynamic documentation, capturing, structuring, presenting, communicating, storing, leveraging, and leading and innovating. And it's a basic framework for actually solving business problems, very relevant for your business analysts, listeners. Also very relevant for learning the different skills required for effective documentation.
Great, great, Adrian. This book. Listen, if you're listening to this right now, you need to go out there, and it really, really helped me. And I know it will help you as well, right? So, Adrian, you've spoken about documentation. Your book talks also about documentation. You've spoken about the big D, the little d, right?
Mhm.
What do you think are some of the most common challenges that professionals face when managing documentation effectively, right? What challenges do they face, right? So
Mhm.
managing documentation effectively, both the big D and the little d.
Yeah,
Yeah, and also, can I drop a second part to that question?
sure, you can drop another one, no problem.
All right, so the second part to it would be, how do these challenges impact project delivery,
Mhm.
right? And overall efficiency?
So I'm going to answer question maybe a little differently. Just there's lots of challenges in the documentation landscape. One is we don't
Hmm.
train. Big picture, we actually don't label it very well, and we don't train for that's, and we don't have good discipline. But I'll give some
Hmm.
specific examples. I actually think, and this is not written anywhere else. One of the biggest challenges with documentation is people are not get good at getting information out of their head and onto paper, and it stalls the process dramatically. That
Hmm.
is actually a skill. If I have an idea in my head, if I have a concept that I want to get on paper, it doesn't mean you need to be a phenomenal writer, but you need the habit of actually putting it in writing. Because if I put in writing, and it doesn't, this doesn't have to always be a formal document. It could be an email, it could be on your whiteboard, it could be in a diagram. If you have information stuck in your head, um, you and it's not really getting out, you'll end up, what happens is projects have either delay because people aren't really communicating their thinking, or they are just spinning in meetings, because a meeting might take like you could consume 60 people's time just talking about your idea over and over again, when you could put that simple idea in writing. I'll just give an example because it's a good one. With Jeff Bezos, when he was building Amazon, he hated PowerPoint, and he actually demanded before his meetings that people put, some person would be assigned, not everyone would write a memo before a meeting. He would demand that someone who is going to share an idea actually put it in a memo so that they had something in writing to discuss without that bias, and those meetings headed for nowhere. I mean, I don't use exactly this technique, but I am a huge proponent of getting information out of people's heads. This is a major issue in our knowledge-based economy when we have a very expensive workforce, very educated workforce, but they don't always get that information, and you don't get as much value out of resource unless it's on paper. So that's one that's one very basic challenge, and it is, in my opinion, a skill. You practice getting information out of your head. Another one, you said managing, so I'll address that a little better. There are basic principles of information management that are not widely known or practiced, and this is an oversight, I think, and like so basic that it's almost laughable. Like, what is a controlled document? How do you bucket your information? What is an approved repository? Like, people can't just store wherever. You don't even need a deep knowledge of information management. But you do. The average knowledge worker needs some understanding of the basics, but that is sadly missing in our workforce. It actually should be more mandatory training. No one not everyone needs to be an information management expert, but we're actually missing that training, and that's why you get so much mess in documentation that should never be there through the life of the project. And absolutely, all these things, if you keep information in your head and don't get it on paper, if our average team doesn't have the basic understanding of how to store things, that leads to a mess as well. And usually project managers are actually pretty good. They understand the basics. They're pretty good. They're pretty organized, but it's often they have to educate others to work the same way and with the same discipline.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Adrian, I think this, when you were speaking now about documentation and how people do it, reminds me of a time when I was on a process improvement project many years ago, and in that project there were four of us
Mm-hmm.
who were going around all the departments, interviewing people on their processes. In that project, I had a schedule of about 4 to 5 process elicitation meetings a day.
Mm.
And one thing that came to me very quickly was that once it went beyond 3 meetings,
Mm-hmm.
eliciting that information, I begin to mix things up or I begin to lose things. So I started cutting them down and saying, hey, I can't do more than 3 meetings a day, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I do not have the time to take everything that's in my head and put it down, right? So what I would do was take a meeting, go back, do my notes, take the next meeting, go back, do my notes, the next meeting, go back, do my notes. And at the end of the day, I would do, a review of all of my notes, do
Mm-hmm.
more comprehensive notes, to now, check everything. Right. So that was an example, right, of me managing my documentation process. Right. Now, I'd like to ask you, Adrienne, what are some of the best practices for creating and maintaining documentation? Right. So I talked about my own, right, how I evolved my own process, right? But what would be the best practices? And what would you have told me of back of that 7, 8 years ago?
Yeah, that's a great example, and you hit right at the title. So I will cheat and use that. I mean, there's a lot of places I can take this answer, but I will go to the core of what I believe is the golden rule of documentation, and that is the 24-hour rule. And it's a rule I invented because of situations like Olu, what you mentioned, with lots of meetings and you need to process information. So 24-hour rule for your listeners who might not know what it is that you just need to rethink, reprocess, or rewrite information in 24 hours of hearing it. That just means do something with information. And
Mm.
it's actually it's not what people think is what documentation is about, but I actually believe it is the golden rule. If we all documentation is better when done in the right time frame. Our we actually do naturally process information in a 24-hour to 48-hour window. Really are, and it is all about the way that the short-term memory bank works. So if for the most basic best practice, absolutely, when you go to a meeting, especially process improve, I do a lot of that work with my clients where you listen to clients and they tell about what's working, what's not working. They talk about what they do. And you really do, and those are a great example where you have to go back. You aren't gonna process it perfectly during the meeting. You have to go back and reflect on what you heard and almost remove yourself from that conversation to kind of critically analyze what you just heard. Okay, I heard this. Does that really make sense? Is that best practice? Those are that is absolutely the right action to take. And your thinking and your recollection of what was said is best in a 24-hour window. Even if you had it recorded, which, you know, not always appropriate, sometimes appropriate, sometimes it isn't. That's a whole other story. We still are energetic connection and information within a 24-hour window is still the best. We're the most efficient and effective and at processing in that. So I will say you kind of you hit the nail on the head. Processing information in the right amount of time, and I say 24 hours. If people are a little bit later than that, that's okay. If you're a little earlier, that's fine. But the point is to actually be honest with how fragile the human memory is and how much better we are at doing things in 24. And this is not just for business analysis meetings, but it's a great example because it's a huge is a huge area where you can't just go to a bunch of meetings on Monday, especially if they're process improvement related or similar, and then think you can work on them 2 weeks later. I mean, even if you're the best note taker, the energy and the ideas you have will be stale, and it'll be harder actually energetically to activate that information. Great example, but you can apply this to if you bump into someone at a conference or hey, I'm gonna put this person on LinkedIn or I'm gonna write down that idea that I heard at that webinar. Like really, you have to actually activate information in the right amount of time. Even project management, great idea. If we have a status update, we have to do something with it now. Like doing things in the right time frame and putting it somewhere is actually golden rule of documentation, and it makes all areas of documentation better when it's done in the right with the most best timeliness. So I will cheat and say I can answer that. There's a lot of best practices, but 24-hour rule is one best practice that improves so many areas of documentation.
Thank you, Adrienne. And yep, that's it. The title of the book is 24-Hour Rule, right? That really works. And I think that's something that really hit the chord, right? When I came across your book, right? Okay, yeah, reminds me of a saying, right, which I heard a couple of years ago that the bluntest pencil is better than the sharpest memory, right?
Yes,
So,
I've heard that too. Yes. And the 24-hour rule is not about perfection.
mhm.
It's about developing discipline for the information that comes into your day, even if it means, taking 5 minutes to pause and reflect on what you heard or reflect on opportunity. It can be actually game changing over the life of your career because we are so busy and so distracted that we're actually not reflecting enough on information and processing it. But those habits are so important, especially in today's knowledge economy.
Great. Okay, so Adrian, I would like to ask you, are there any specific tools or technology you recommend for managing documentation
That's a
across, right?
great question. I'm going to answer that one quickly. I actually think the tools on the market are great. I'm quite tool agnostic. When I wake up in the morning and I look at my clients, documentation issues, it is rarely a result of not having tools available. There's so many vendors out there. So I mean, we even AI is such a big topic right now, but AI has been in document management for a long time. Like this, to me, it's not a very new conversation.
Yeah.
We've had phenomenal tools in the information management. I've been going to for 10 years at least. Like they've had amazing. So it's funny. It doesn't seem like a new conversation to me, even though it's really topical. I am completely agnostic on the tool side. I actually think, like, I love SharePoint. I use Dropbox for business. I mean, I like Google. I mean, yes, I do use Google too for certain things, although I don't, and nothing private, that's for sure. But tools are not the issue. And you and I have geeked out about PKM tools. Those are great too. Again, there's no absence of great tools right now, and I'm not even going there with the information management space. The tools are actually quite advanced to see for you to have information on what documents you have. The problem is companies aren't using them. We don't have policy in place. We don't have habits in place. That's really the kicker that's actually blocking successful implementation of the tools.
Great.
I hope
Thank
that's
you,
not, I know
Adrian.
my IT crowd, I don't know if that's the right answer for the IT crowd, but that's my honest assessment of the
Yeah, okay.
market.
So I think what people would like to know also would be what would you watch out for, or what are the main criteria you would use to, select something you want to use for information management with all these tools being thrown in our face every day.
How to select the best tool. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in the information management space. The first thing you do have to understand, policy is very policy is very important in information management. And it sounds like a silly answer, but you have to be clear on what you want to control and how long you want to keep information
Right.
and how much granularity you need. Uh, so basic, strangely, this is a strange answer, but it's actually true. Understanding, being very clear on policy will actually dictate what tool you buy because the tools are different. Like if you need to keep things forever, then maybe you need something different than if you keep things for a shorter window. Um, or if you need really sophisticated search, or if you need really sophisticated metadata and stuff like that, you might need something different. You don't want to go buy a Ferrari if you just need a scooter, right? You want the right tool suited for your business. Information management policy sounds basic, but it's not well implemented at many companies, and people trip up on what they actually need the tool for. But if they get clear on that, it would make the tool decision a lot easier. That's the honest truth. It is a stumbling block right now in organizations.
Absolutely, Adrian. Absolutely, absolutely. I've worked with a number of organizations that
Mm-hmm.
have gone through the process of changing how they manage information, right? And you see you see that a lot, right? And what happens a lot of times is, you begin to get changes in policy, right? Changes in process of how, these things are managed. And usually there's a lot of friction, right? Between between you know implementing the system and the people actually using the system. So people say things like, oh, it used to be so much easier. I'll just dump something in a folder and then I'm gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And someone now comes and says, hey, um, you need to put in all this metadata. You need to put in all these tags to properly identify, where this is, right? And it doesn't matter what folder it's in, right? Some others will say, well, you need to categorize it using this kind of criteria. What would you say to people who are in the space or in the box of managing this change, right?
Yeah.
Because, like I told you, it's a lot of friction all the time.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, we could talk for half an hour about how much people hate filling in metadata. It's true. It is. So that's actually it's a bit of a side. Okay, Me- metadata is a good example of where there's a lot of friction. People, okay, now you have to every document you have to fill in 10 fields of metadata. People go, what? I'm not doing this. My advice on this uh, is metadata is one area. Unfortunately, your policy decisions does depend on a lot of factors. Um, but if you, one reason why people don't like doing certain things, like the metadata filling in, that's a great example, huge friction, is that often it's not, doesn't make a lot of business sense. Like they don't, like there are other ways. So first of all, if you're going to put users through torture, like getting them to fill in 10 fields of metadata, I'm just an example, but it's actually a good example. It's actually a relevant example. You have to be very clear that there's business value for it because there's actually, even in the information management space, I know we're going off talking there because we can, there are different ways, there are different priorities. Sometimes you put a lot of priority on where to put things or naming conventions or the tools you use to find things. Um, yeah, anyhow, the metadata situation uh, does depend on the situation. Like you need metadata is usually used when you have a very specific search, and you should only put users through that if there's a really good business reason for doing that. And metadata does have a purpose in some contexts. It's great, and sometimes it's way less relevant. So that's where policy comes in. You can't just have policies that say all documents need metadata, or no one's going to follow you because that's relevant for specific types, usually high profile things that need specific search. But I could go off a lot on this. But again, a lot comes down to policy being very reasonable and practical for your users and recognizing that little d, that little habits are going to break your whole
Yeah,
perfectly planned process. You need to be really
exactly.
connect with your user.
Exactly. Our big D and our little D, right?
Yeah.
You spoke about it, Adrian, but I want you to quickly just go over it again, right? For people who didn't catch it the first time. What's this idea about a big D and little D? What's it about?
Well, it's just the idea that documentation is not all the formal stuff. I mean, we talk, when we go to conferences, we talk about concepts I call big D. Transformation, it has been the hottest. Transformation has been I would say that is a classic big D concept. And it really isn't, I mean, we kind of put a formal title on something that's, we've done for a long time. Like, you talk about, I would almost, transformation is a really another knockoff of process improvement that we've been doing for a long time. And it's given different names over the years. Um, but, big D is like that formal stuff we talk about. We talk about records, we talk about information management, we talk about policies, we talk about our enterprise systems. Little d is those habits. Like to me, it's just what people do to write their notes, to get information out of their heads, to process information using the 24-hour rule. And I actually believe we have to train people better in these everyday skills in order to actually make our big D projects work. So there's always a tension between the two of them. I know we talk about it a little differently in the change management space, but I actually see the two as kind of working together. You don't always just implement, you know, big C change, let's call it that. Like you can implement a new system and then train people afterwards. That's not always the best approach. Sometimes you actually build skills first. Like in the example of sales, um, sometimes it's better to get people to practice writing down sales leads first before you move to a system. You actually have to build skills sometimes before the system comes, but that's not the way we traditionally think of change. And anyhow, the same idea applies in the documentation space. There is a tension between the two of them in the work world, and you need both of them to work together for your projects to be successful.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the little d, right? It's more about us, learning these habits, and taking them on every day. Um, so for someone who hasn't developed these habits yet or doesn't really know how to develop them, um, do you have any learning resources out there which you would suggest for people?
Well, that's my book. Well, I guess sure I'll give my shameless plug on the book.
Yeah,
Um,
the 24-hour rule.
yeah, yeah, right there. So even resources, how to take notes. Like I really like that is a habit super important to develop. It's almost sounds not very glamorous, but it's a really important skill. How to get information out of your head, how to process information, 24-hour rule, how to write effectively, very basics in information management that, I actually think are little d skills. Basics in visual presentation. These are all kind of, I see as power skills that are so important in so many knowledge based, definitely BAs. A lot of these skills probably hit very closely to what BAs do. But it's more than just BA. I mean, there's so many people in roles that require these skills, but we don't always formalize and teach them enough. Actually, BA, because I know you certainly do a lot of work in the BA profession, BA skills, even if someone as a knock on to my book as well, a lot of skills you develop in business analysis, I think, are largely those little d skill like that I just mentioned. So for your listeners, like even if they don't want to be full-time BAs, even learning some of those skills in BA type roles can be very beneficial for your career. That there's so much, I would say, so much part of that little d that you use to solve bigger D problems.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. I think you've even answered my last question, right? But
Okay.
I'm just gonna ask it. I'm just gonna ask it, right? If you had anything to add to that, which was, what advice would you give to people in the IT space, especially people like business analysts, product owners, project managers who are looking to improve their documentation practices, right? What advice would you give to them?
My number one advice is it's about your execution and what you do. It's you don't even certainly don't need to buy my book or buy some fancy course. It's really about what you do every day that develop it's in some ways it's an it's I wouldn't say it's easy to be disciplined about how you manage information because we are inundated by it, but it's also not expensive. You don't have to buy an expensive course or get your MBA or do all these other things. You really practicing taking good notes, and there's a ton of resources online. Gen Z is really talking about in the note world, practicing getting information out of your head. You can write a blog, you can write an idea to your boss, you can just pick those ideas. You can put your hand up to do a summary of what you learned at a conference for your team. All these little everyday little d actions are such important power skills, and they're not expensive to develop. So I would encourage note taking, personal acknowledgement. We didn't get into that today, but that's actually a great area to develop a lot of these skills as well. And there's a lot of great resources online. But you don't have to put a lot of money into this. You just have to put the attention to develop this. And there's lots of opportunity, I think, in your personal life, in your work life, or in online communities to build these skills.
Right. Thank you so much, Adrienne. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your time. So, listeners, folks, if you've been listening to this, I've been talking to Adrienne Bellehumeur, the author of the 24-hour rule. Um, Adrienne, where can we get this book if we want to buy it?
It's available on Amazon, on Penguin Random House site, pretty much any major retailers. So, absolutely, if you want to, for more information about documentation, my website is bellhumorco.com, or please connect with me on LinkedIn. I love adding people on LinkedIn. And my compliance firm is riskoversight.ca too, but love to connect if anyone has any questions. The book is available absolutely everywhere too. So
Thank you so much, Adrienne. And with that,
thank you.
I'd like to say to everyone, enjoy the rest of your day.